Good evening, I'm Joseph Dobrian. Welcome to another show. I thought that this time, since a presidential election year is going on here in 2016 and we're all sort of dreading what's going to happen in January when the new president takes over, I thought it would be fun to go back to another presidential campaign, one that was not quite as horrible and painful as this one has been. I'd like to talk about the 1964 presidential campaign. This was the first one that I followed. I was 7 and then 8 years old in the course of 1964, and I was just starting to take an interest in politics. I was kind of a dissenter right from the very beginning, even at the age of 7 or so. My parents were very political, and our dinner table conversation would often consist of political discussions. And my parents were pretty much old-fashioned New Deal Democrats. And they would be talking about how the government should do this, the government should do that, so on and so on. And here I was, maybe 7 years old, saying, wait a minute, I don't think that's the government's job. So I guess I was a little bit of a libertarian, a little bit of a Republican, even at that time, as far as I could figure things out. Now, the 1964 presidential campaign, as I say, it was the first one that I followed, turned out to be a lot different from what everybody thought it was going to be the previous year. We had John F. Kennedy in the White House. He had been inaugurated in January of 1961, and he was an immensely popular president. He was charismatic, he was good-looking, he had a sparkling personality. His policies maybe weren't the best, but people were willing to forgive him for that because, gosh, he was just so glamorous, and you just felt like a better person from hearing him speak or knowing that he was in the White House. It was sort of the effect of attending a Pete Seeger concert. You just felt like you yourself were a good person through association with what was going on. So there was a tremendous spirit of optimism coming out of the Kennedy White House in the early 1960s. Even though we were having some terrible troubles with foreign policy and we were beginning to have some pretty serious domestic issues as well, the general feeling was quite optimistic. And there was a presidential election that was going to come up in 1964, and Kennedy was almost certain to run for re-election. And the general feeling was that he was almost certain to be re-elected. He was very popular. His standing in the polls was very high. And it looked like the Republicans were going to nominate one of two candidates. They might go with Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, who represented the right wing of the party back then, or they might go with Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York, who represented the left liberal wing of the Republican Party. Some would have said that he was more of a Democrat than a Republican, really. That's always been the rap against Republicans, that they are the Me Too party, that they don't really differ that much from the Democrats. They are for everything the Democrats are for, with just a little bit less heat. And when you looked at a fellow like Nelson Rockefeller in those days, that was sort of the impression he gave you. But neither of these guys, Goldwater or Rockefeller, were expected to present much of a challenge to John F. Kennedy, who was so darn popular at the time. So it was generally conceded that in 1964 the Republicans would nominate one of those two guys, and that guy would be beaten by President Kennedy, and that the Republican Party would just have to look ahead to 1968. Well, it didn't happen that way, because on November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. And all of a sudden, the new president was Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas, who had been Kennedy's vice president. Johnson was quite a different character from Kennedy. He was much more of a professional politician, and he had maneuvered his way through Texas politics for many years, got elected to the United States Senate in 1948, and quickly became one of the most powerful senators in the history of the body. Then in 1960, he was running for the presidential nomination and didn't quite make it because John F. Kennedy had more delegates. So Johnson, much against the advice of several of his cohorts, accepted the nomination for vice president. Well, he went from being a very, very powerful man in the United States Senate to being pretty much a eunuch as vice president. He wasn't really able to take part in policy making and was regarded by the Kennedys as a sort of an embarrassment. So he wasn't very happy there as vice president. And then this assassination happened. President Kennedy was dead. Lyndon Johnson all of a sudden was president of the United States. And as it turned out, he was much more progressive, much more liberal than Kennedy had been. He realized that in order to ensure his reelection and to perpetuate the power of the Democratic Party, he would have to push for very liberal social legislation, including what became the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and various social welfare initiatives that constituted what was called the Great Society program. So going into the 1964 presidential campaign, it looked like Johnson was going to be running on this very left-wing progressive platform. And it still looked like his opponent for the presidency would be either Governor Rockefeller or Senator Goldwater at the beginning of 1964. That's what it looked like. And it also looked like Johnson was certain to beat either of them because Johnson, of course, was not as popular as Kennedy. He was not as well beloved as Kennedy by a long shot. He was not really trusted by most people. He was generally regarded as a bit of a schemer and not entirely honest. But people just were not going to be ready to have 3 different presidents within the span of a year. So it was generally agreed that it was highly unlikely that Johnson would be voted out of office in November of 1964. And of course, there was nobody opposing him for the Democrat nomination. So really the big excitement in the 1964 presidential campaign was going to be on the Republican side. Who were the Republicans going to nominate? Now, the Republicans were in bad shape at that time because A, they knew that it was highly unlikely that they could beat Lyndon Johnson at the end of the year. B, they just didn't have a candidate who was going to be able to run without dividing the party. Goldwater had his base on the right, and he was going to definitely alienate the more moderate to left-wing Republicans. Rockefeller had the opposite problem. He could count on his base of progressive Republicans, but he would totally alienate the right wing of the party, which Goldwater controlled. Now, there were several other minor candidates who tended to gravitate toward the center, who might have been regarded as compromise candidates if only one of them could have commanded a lot of respect within the party. There was, for example, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was a diplomat and former senator who had been the vice presidential candidate in 1960 when Richard Nixon had been the Republican nominee for president. But Lodge was regarded as kind of a lightweight, not really a very serious candidate, and he did not really take his own candidacy very seriously. He did not campaign hard. He just figured maybe the nomination might come to him, but he wasn't going to do anything about it. And then they had a candidate named Margaret Chase Smith. She was a senator from Maine. She was really the first woman to run for the presidency as a major party candidate. She was running for the Republican nomination, but nobody really thought she had a chance. She wasn't well known. At that time, the idea of electing a woman president was rather outlandish. So she was more regarded as a curiosity than anything else. Then there was Harold Stassen, the former governor of Minnesota. He was quite progressive on foreign policy issues, less so on domestic issues. But he was also regarded as a lightweight because he had been running for the presidency on and off since the mid-1940s and had never gotten there. And by 1964, he was kind of regarded as a standing joke in the Republican Party. Meanwhile, both Nelson Rockefeller and Barry Goldwater, the two frontrunners, were sort of reluctant to take the nomination. Goldwater said that now that his friendly rival Jack Kennedy was dead, he just didn't have the stomach for the race. He said he would have enjoyed running against Kennedy, whom he regarded as a personal friend even though they differed politically, but he just didn't have the heart for it. Rockefeller, on the other hand, clearly wanted very, very badly to be president, but he thought apparently that it was beneath him to go out and campaign for it. He wanted the presidency to come to him. He wanted the leadership of the Republican Party to come to him and say, "Governor, we want you to run." But he wasn't prepared to go out and launch a real serious campaign in the primaries and the caucuses and so on. Now bear in mind, in 1964, the presidential nomination process was a lot less transparent than it is today. A lot of it was done behind closed doors. There were a lot of backroom deals by party insiders. And frankly, I think that was probably the better way to do it. I think the process has become a little bit too democratized. I say that with a small d. It refers to both Republicans and Democrats in this issue. But we are allowing our presidential nominees to be chosen by people who don't know their ass from their elbow and who consequently end up nominating some really pathetic candidates, as we saw in 2016. In 1964, it wasn't like that. There were a few states that chose their delegates by primary elections, a few that used caucuses, but mostly the delegates were rounded up by an inner clique of party regulars. This applied to both Democrats and Republicans. They would get together and decide who the delegates were going to be and how they would vote. Now, in a situation like that, it's difficult for a fellow like Nelson Rockefeller to go in there and round up delegates if he's not willing to do the work, if he's not willing to go to each state's Republican Party, to the regulars, and present his case and persuade them to be for him at the convention. See, because there were so few primaries in those days, the nomination really was going to be decided at the convention, not by a gradual system of primaries. So primaries weren't highly regarded in 1964, and in the first primary of the year, the New Hampshire primary, nobody campaigned very hard. None of the major candidates spent a lot of time campaigning in New Hampshire because they thought that it didn't make a heck of a lot of difference. And indeed, it really didn't. It was pretty much of a beauty contest. On primary day in March of 1964, the surprise winner of the New Hampshire primary was Henry Cabot Lodge, whom nobody had taken seriously. Rockefeller came in second, Goldwater came in third. People just said, oh, it doesn't matter. The fireworks have yet to begin. And that happened also with a few other primaries that took place in the ensuing few months. Where the action was really taking place, as I mentioned before, was in those conferences with party regulars, with people who had been involved in the party for many years and who wielded positions of power. Goldwater and his surrogates were doing that work. They were going to state after state after state. They were meeting with party chairmen, with county chairmen, with precinct level people. They were really getting in there, really building support for their candidate. And so before anybody knew it, Goldwater had secured the vote of a great many delegates who had not been chosen publicly. They had not been chosen by primaries. They had not even been chosen by public caucuses. So he had been doing a lot of work behind the scenes. Goldwater and his gang were doing a lot of work behind the scenes, and this was all perfectly legal. This is just how it was done in those days. And so by the time the primary season, such as it was then, was nearly over, Goldwater had rounded up pretty nearly a majority of the Republican delegates. Then in May of 1964 came the Oregon primary. Oregon, as it is today, was quite a liberal state, and its Republican Party tended to be dominated by the lefty progressive wing of the Republican Party. And so Rockefeller won the Oregon primary very convincingly, and this put him right back into the picture as a possible rival to Goldwater at the convention. So the big prize coming up a couple of weeks after that was the California primary. It was generally conceded that if Goldwater were to win the California primary, that was the ball game. He would then have an insurmountable majority of delegate votes, and that would be that. If Rockefeller won the California primary, and there was a good chance that he would because the California Republican Party was pretty equally divided between the left wing and the right wing. If Rockefeller could win California, then he would seriously damage Goldwater's credibility, and there might, after all, be a real fight for the nomination at the Republican convention in San Francisco later that year. Well, at first it looked like Rockefeller was going to win the California primary. The polls had him ahead, but here is what happened to croak his chances. The year before, Nelson Rockefeller had divorced his first wife, or she had divorced him. At any rate, they were divorced because he had found another girl. Now, in those days, divorce was regarded much more seriously than it is today. A divorced man in politics was severely handicapped, and you couldn't realistically expect to be elected president if you were divorced. A couple of presidential candidates had been divorced, and they had both lost the election. Well, Nelson Rockefeller divorced his first wife and married a lady named Margareta Murphy. She was nicknamed Happy, and that's how everybody always referred to her. Well, Nelson and Happy got pregnant right after they got married, and just a couple of days before the California primary, Happy gave birth to their son. Well, that just served to remind the voters of California that Governor Rockefeller had been involved in a very public divorce and had left his wife for a younger woman, and now he had a child with this younger woman. And that really motivated the right wing of the Republican Party to get out there and vote for Goldwater in the California primary. So on primary day, which I believe was June the 3rd of 1964, Goldwater beat Rockefeller in the California primary. He won every one of California's delegates, and at that point the ball game was over. It was clear that Goldwater would come into the San Francisco convention with a clear majority of the delegates. At the same time, it pretty much finished Nelson Rockefeller as a credible presidential candidate. So now Rockefeller and his friends on the left progressive wing of the party were trying to find another candidate who could conceivably stop Goldwater. Maybe they thought they could come up with another candidate who could unify the left and the center and peel off maybe a few of the undecided delegates, just enough to deny Goldwater the nomination. And the guy they decided on was the governor of Pennsylvania, William Scranton, man with a long record of public service, also more on the left to moderate wing of the Republican Party, although a little bit less so than Rockefeller had been. But Rockefeller said to him, "Bill, we need you to run." So at that point, very late in the game, just about a month before the convention, Governor Scranton of Pennsylvania said that he would allow his name to be placed in nomination. Well, the Republican convention was a real doozy, because on the one hand, everybody knew that it was a foregone conclusion almost that Goldwater would be the nominee. On the other hand, there were a ton of Republicans who were horrified at the idea that Goldwater would be nominated. For one thing, they figured he was so far to the right that he would not stand a chance against Lyndon Johnson in November. Some other candidate probably would lose also, but at least he might be able to make it close. He might be able to save the Republicans from complete humiliation. With Goldwater, they were in big trouble. Goldwater also got himself into trouble just because of his big mouth. Now, Goldwater was a good man. I admired and admire Goldwater. He was a great American, one of the greatest in my opinion. But he had a big mouth and he shot it off. Sometimes he would say things that weren't exactly diplomatic. For example, when he was involved in a discussion about smart bombs, about nuclear devices that were able to pinpoint their targets very carefully, he said that our nuclear technology was such that we could lob one into the men's room of the Kremlin. Now, he wasn't saying that he wanted to lob a nuclear device into the men's room of the Kremlin, but of course, the Democrats put that spin on it. It was all, oh my God, Goldwater is going to nuke the Russians. Goldwater is going to start World War III. Goldwater is going to blow us all to kingdom come. Well, you know how politics works. Sometimes the narrative is more powerful than the facts, and that was the narrative. All of a sudden, we had half of the country, or maybe even more than half, convinced that Goldwater was a dangerous nut. Then there was the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, which was passed by the Senate, which provided that public accommodations must be open to all people regardless of race, and various other provisions that pretty much ended the Jim Crow-style segregation of the Deep South. Well, Goldwater was not in favor of segregation, but he opposed civil rights legislation on the grounds that it went too far. He felt that the Civil Rights Bill, as it was stated, exceeded the government's mandate. It gave the federal government much too much power that they should not have. And so he voted against it on that principle. Of course, the Democrats put spin on that too. They said, oh, Goldwater is voting against civil rights because he He's in favor of segregation. He's in favor of Jim Crow. He's a racist. Well, Goldwater didn't have a racist bone in his body. Lyndon Johnson, on the other hand, when that civil rights bill was passed, he privately remarked, "I'll have them niggers voting Democrat for the next 200 years. Well, who's the racist, I ask you? I'm editorializing here, but it's my show. I can do that if I want to. Anyway, at the Republican convention in 1964, there was tremendous division. There was a Stop Goldwater movement, which never looked like it was going to get off the ground. Rockefeller was holding on to the few paltry votes that he had and was trying to throw other votes to Governor Scranton of Pennsylvania in a vain attempt to deny Goldwater the nomination. The tensions came to a head on the Tuesday night of the convention, the night before the nomination, when Governor Rockefeller got up to speak in favor of a resolution condemning the John Birch Society. Well, the Goldwater people were not having it. Now, mind you, the Goldwater delegates on the floor had been instructed, do not boo, do not try to impede his speech, sit quietly, let him talk. And they did that. The Goldwater delegates were fine. Unfortunately, the galleries at the convention were packed with Goldwater supporters who had not been given these instructions and who acted like a bunch of assholes and tried to shout Nelson Rockefeller down. And I don't like it when the left does it to the right. I don't like it when the right does it to the left. This was a disgraceful incident in American politics. Rockefeller finally got to talk, but he did it to a chorus of boos all the way through. And that just made the Republican Party look like hell. If they had any fleeting chance of winning the election, they just totally lost it when Nelson Rockefeller was damn near booed off of the platform at their convention. Well, the following night, Barry Goldwater was nominated as the Republican candidate. The following night, he got up there and gave his acceptance speech, and it was a loud, strident, angry acceptance speech. I liked it. I thought he was saying exactly what needed to be said. But he didn't sound moderate. He didn't sound nice. Somebody commented, "Oh my God, he's going to run as Barry Goldwater." And he did. He did. His campaign slogan was a choice, not an echo. Because for once, the Republicans were not running a Me Too candidate. They were not saying, yeah, we're for everything the Democrats are for, only just with a little more moderation. Goldwater was out there preaching self-reliance, preaching a strong defense, preaching as much isolationism as he could get away with. He wanted government out of social programs. He wanted government to be as small as possible. And that just wasn't the way the political wind was blowing at that time. So Goldwater never had a chance of winning the election, and he went down to a crushing defeat. He got something like 38% of the popular vote to Johnson's 61%. The electoral vote was 486 to 52. And Goldwater was an historical curio for the rest of his career. But oh my, what a fun campaign that was for a little boy of 8. What a great campaign to cut my political teeth on. That's all for tonight. Thanks very much. Good night.